The night always begins the same way in my memory, too quiet, too perfect, like the world was holding its breath before something irreversible broke. "You know," Ethan Blake said that evening, stirring his drink without even looking at me, "I've made my decision." I remember the sound of ice hitting glass, slow and deliberate, like a countdown I didn't understand yet. Madison Carter didn't say anything either. She just sat beside him, close enough that I could feel how far away I had already become. I was standing there with my hands folded, pretending I wasn't shaking, pretending I didn't already know what was coming. But you always know. You just lie to yourself first so it hurts less when it finally happens. "It's going to be Madison," Ethan continued, finally lifting his eyes toward me, but not really seeing me, like I was already background noise in his future. I looked at him for a long moment, searching for the version of him I used to believe in. The one who once said my name like it mattered. But people change their tone before they change your life. That's the warning no one teaches you. "I see," I said quietly. My voice surprised even me, steady, controlled, almost distant. Madison reached for his hand like it was natural, like it had always been hers to take. I remember thinking how quickly I had been edited out of my own story. Not erased loudly, not destroyed dramatically, just replaced, like a page torn out and rewritten without ink. I turned slightly toward the window instead of them. Outside, the city lights of Chicago stretched across the horizon, cold and indifferent, like they had witnessed this scene 1,000 times before. That's when I first heard the name. Not from Ethan. Not from Madison. From the man who had been sitting in the far corner of the room the entire time, silent as if he had been part of the furniture. Victor Moretti. 65 years old. A name spoken in low tones in places people don't feel safe after dark. "She has something," he said simply, as if continuing a thought no one else was allowed to hear. Everyone turned slightly, even Ethan. But I didn't. I already felt it, the shift in air, the way attention doesn't ask permission when it belongs to power. "She would understand structure," Victor added, his gaze finally landing on me, not soft, not cruel, just certain. That was the first time I realized being seen isn't always the same as being chosen. Ethan laughed under his breath like it was absurd. Madison didn't understand what was happening at all. But I did. Because something in the way Victor spoke didn't sound like an offer. It sounded like a conclusion already reached somewhere I hadn't been invited to. I should have walked away then. I should have felt afraid. But what I felt instead was something far more dangerous, clarity. As if the world I had been trying to survive in was suddenly too small for me. And for the first time that night, I stopped asking why I wasn't chosen. I started wondering what it meant to be chosen by someone else entirely. I did not sleep that night. Not because I was crying or because something inside me was breaking in the way people expect, but because my mind had become too quiet, too aware, as if every thought was standing at attention waiting for something irreversible to be said again. The memory of that evening kept repeating itself in fragments, Ethan Blake's voice, Madison Carter's silence, and the way Victor Moretti had looked at me like I was not an accident in the room but a decision already forming somewhere beyond it. The next morning came with pale light through my apartment window in Chicago, the city already moving as if nothing had changed, as if my entire world had not shifted on its axis hours before. I made coffee I did not drink and sat by the table staring at my phone, waiting for something I could not name but already felt approaching. Around midday, it arrived. Not as a call, not as a message, but through a man I had never seen before standing at my door in a dark coat, holding a sealed envelope with my name written in precise, unfamiliar handwriting. He did not explain himself. He simply handed it to me with a respectful nod and left as quietly as he had come. I remember the weight of that envelope more than its paper, like it carried something heavier than ink. When I opened it, there was no greeting, no warmth. Only a formal structure of words that felt less like a request and more like a defined path already waiting for a signature. It spoke of arrangement, of alignment, of a future that did not ask for permission from the past I thought I belonged to. And beneath it, a single line that stayed with me longer than anything else: stability is not offered, it is recognized. I sat there for a long time reading it again and again, not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear. Ethan called twice during that hour. I did not answer. I knew what he would sound like: confusion turning into realization, realization turning into something softer and more dangerous, regret disguised as urgency. But regret has a strange timing. It always arrives after certainty has already left the room. By evening, I found myself walking without direction through downtown streets, the wind colder than I expected for that time of year, people passing by in coats and conversations that had nothing to do with me. That was when I understood something quietly: I was no longer inside the story I thought I was living. I was outside of it, observing it like someone who had been written out but still remembered every line. When I returned home, the envelope was still on my table, untouched, patient. I sat across from it as if it were a person, and for the first time, I did not feel replaced. I felt repositioned. As if something larger than emotion had already decided where I belonged next, even if I had not yet agreed to follow. And in that silence, I made my choice without saying it out loud, because some decisions are not spoken. They are accepted in the moment you stop asking if you are still wanted where you once stood. The address came the next morning without warning, as if it had always existed and I had simply been delayed in discovering it. A black car waited outside my building in Chicago, engine running quietly, the driver stepping out only long enough to open the door for me without a single word. I remember hesitating for less than a second, not out of fear, but out of the strange awareness that once I stepped inside, nothing familiar would have authority over me anymore. The city moved past the tinted windows as we drove, familiar streets dissolving into unfamiliar distance, until even the rhythm of traffic felt like it belonged to someone else's life. We crossed out of the center of Chicago into quieter districts where the buildings became spaced farther apart, more private, more controlled, until finally the car turned into a gated property surrounded by tall iron fencing and trees that blocked the world from seeing in. No one announced him. No one needed to. Victor Moretti was already there before I arrived, standing near the entrance of a large residence that felt less like a home and more like a statement carved into architecture. He did not smile when he saw me. He simply observed me the way someone observes weather changing, not surprised, only confirming what they already predicted. "You came," he said, as if the possibility of refusal had never been part of the equation. I did not answer immediately. My voice felt unnecessary in that space, like sound itself had to earn permission. Instead, I stepped forward, and that was enough. Inside, the air was still and precise, everything arranged with intention rather than comfort. There were no traces of chaos, no softness left unattended. Only structure. Only control. Only silence that felt earned rather than forced. Victor guided me through the space without unnecessary explanation, as if the rules of this world were not meant to be taught but recognized. And somewhere between the hallway and the main room, I understood something I had not understood before: this was not a rescue, not an escape, not even an arrangement in the way ordinary people understood it. It was alignment with something older than my previous life. A different gravity. Later, he spoke again, not loudly, never needing to. "People think loyalty is given," he said, standing near a window that overlooked distant trees. "But it is chosen under pressure. That is where truth lives." I did not know how to respond to that either, so I did what I had been doing since I arrived in his orbit. I listened. Not as someone waiting to agree or disagree, but as someone beginning to understand the shape of a world that did not apologize for existing. Hours passed without ceremony. No contracts were emphasized, no promises repeated. Only presence. Only the quiet acknowledgement that my arrival had already altered something irreversible. That evening, when I finally saw my reflection in a darkened mirror inside the house, I barely recognized the stillness in my own face. It was not sadness. It was not hope. It was transition. Somewhere far away, Ethan Blake was still speaking words that no longer had a place to land. But here, in this silence structured by power and certainty, I was no longer being spoken about. I was being positioned. And for the first time, I understood that being chosen was not about being wanted in the way I once believed. It was about being placed where the world could no longer ignore you. By the time the city learned to move without me in it, I was already living inside a different rhythm of time. The house of Victor Moretti did not feel like a place that changed with hours or weather. It felt like it existed outside of both. Morning light arrived without softness, only precision, cutting through tall windows in straight lines that never scattered. I began to understand that nothing here happened by accident. Even silence had structure. Even waiting had purpose. I spent most of the first days observing more than speaking, because speaking felt like stepping into a conversation that had already begun long before I arrived. Victor never demanded my attention. He simply assumed it. That assumption was heavier than any command. One afternoon, while I stood near the same window I had grown used to, he said something without turning toward me. "Do you know why people fear change?" I did not answer immediately. I had learned that silence was not emptiness here. It was participation. Because change does not ask who you were, he continued. It only decides who you are next. I remember those words settling into me without resistance, like they had been waiting for the right environment to exist. Outside, the grounds of the property remained still, distant trees unmoving, as if even nature had agreed to respect the boundaries of this place. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that I first felt the outside world trying to reach me again. My phone, which I had left untouched for hours, finally lit up with repeated notifications. Ethan Blake's name appeared more than once, followed by messages that began with certainty and slowly dissolved into something closer to disbelief. I did not open them immediately. I already knew the shape of what they would say. First confusion. Then correction. Then regret trying to disguise itself as explanation. But I was no longer inside the version of myself that those messages belonged to. When I finally read them, it felt like reading words addressed to someone I used to know. Someone who still believed that love was something that could be distributed evenly between choices. Between people. Between consequences. Madison Carter's name appeared in one of the messages too, mentioned briefly, almost carelessly, as if she had already become part of a decision that no longer required emotional weight. I turned the phone face down and did not pick it up again. That evening, Victor asked me to join him in a room I had not yet entered. It was not large, but it carried the same intentional stillness as everything else. There were no decorations that spoke of sentiment, only objects placed with purpose, each one suggesting history without demanding explanation. He stood near a desk and placed a thin document in front of me without ceremony. "This is not about ownership," he said calmly. "It is about recognition." I looked at the paper but did not touch it right away. Words on it were formal, structured, detached from emotion in a way that made them feel more permanent than anything I had known before. "People outside will try to interpret this in ways that make sense to them," he added. "Let them. Meaning is not required for truth to function." I finally signed my name. Not because I fully understood everything it represented, but because I understood something more important. There was no version of my previous life waiting for me that still fit. When I set the pen down, Victor did not acknowledge it with celebration or approval. He only nodded slightly, as if confirming a pattern he had already seen complete itself in his mind. Later that night, alone in my room, I stood again in front of the mirror. My reflection was the same, but the context around it was not. The stillness in my eyes no longer looked like loss. It looked like placement. And somewhere beyond the walls of this place, I knew there was still a man trying to understand a story that had already stopped belonging to him the moment he failed to recognize its direction. The first sign that the outside world had not accepted my disappearance came not in person, but in presence. Not physical presence, but digital, social, and unavoidable. My name began appearing in places it had never appeared before, attached to conversations I had never been part of. At first, it was subtle, like distant noise through a closed door. Then it became structured, repeated, impossible to ignore. Ethan Blake had started speaking publicly about choices he had made, though he never said my name directly. He did not need to. Everyone already knew who he meant. I watched it once from a screen inside the house of Victor Moretti, seated alone in a room designed for quiet focus. The television displayed a brief segment from a local Chicago interview, where Ethan's expression carried the kind of discomfort that only comes when certainty has already failed. He spoke about timing, about misunderstanding value, about realizing things too late. But there was something in his voice that no longer sounded like confidence. It sounded like correction without resolution. Madison Carter appeared beside him in one photograph shared briefly online, smiling in a way that looked rehearsed rather than lived. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like placement without conviction. I turned the screen off before the segment ended. Not because it hurt, but because it no longer connected to where I was standing. Inside this house, time did not move through public validation. It moved through decisions already finalized. That afternoon, Victor asked me to accompany him to a private gathering. He did not describe it as an event. He described it as continuity. We traveled without announcement, the city passing again behind tinted glass. Chicago unfolding in layers of glass and steel, unaware of the smaller transformation happening inside its periphery. The location was not extravagant in the way people expect from wealth. It was controlled, restrained, and intentional, filled with individuals who did not seek attention but naturally attracted it. I noticed how conversations stopped slightly when Victor entered, not out of fear, but recognition. Authority does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it only changes the temperature of a room. I remained close to him, not as someone being hidden, but as someone being introduced without announcement. People looked at me, then looked again, as if recalculating something they thought they understood. No one asked questions directly. That was the rule of spaces like this. Questions were replaced with observation. Observation eventually became understanding. At one point, I overheard a brief exchange about transition, about how quickly perception adjusts when a new structure becomes visible. No one mentioned my past directly, but I felt it in the gaps between their words. I was no longer a person being discussed as an absence. I was becoming a reference point for something shifting. Later that evening, Victor spoke to me near a quiet corner away from the main gathering. "Do you feel how quickly people adjust?" he asked. I nodded slightly, though I was still learning what exactly I was meant to be feeling. "That is not respect," he continued. "It is recognition of permanence." I did not respond immediately. The word permanent settled differently than I expected. Not heavy. Not limiting. But stabilizing. When we returned that night, the house felt unchanged, yet I no longer experienced it as unfamiliar. Something inside me had stopped resisting its structure. Before sleeping, I checked my phone one final time. There were more messages from Ethan Blake, but they had changed tone again. Less explanation. More uncertainty. More gaps where confidence used to be. I did not reply. Instead, I placed the phone face down once more and looked at my reflection in the darkened window. I did not see someone lost anymore. I saw someone already positioned in a place others were still trying to understand. And for the first time, the silence around my life did not feel like absence. It felt like alignment with something that was no longer waiting to be approved. The next shift in my life did not come through public attention or private silence, but through family, the kind of family that pretends distance is the same as neutrality until it is forced to reveal itself. I was invited to a formal dinner that Victor Moretti described only as necessary, a word he used whenever something carried more weight than explanation. The location was another property, quieter than the main residence, with long corridors and a dining space designed not for celebration but for presence. I entered without expectation, yet I noticed immediately that I was not the only person adjusting to this arrangement. Victor's extended circle was already there, composed, observant, and careful with their expressions, as if emotion itself required permission. I sat beside Victor without hesitation now, something that would have once felt impossible, and I realized that even that small act of positioning no longer carried uncertainty. Halfway through the evening, a conversation surfaced naturally around legacy and connection, the kind of discussion people have when they are trying to understand where influence begins and ends. My name was not spoken directly, but I felt it in the way pauses formed around certain sentences. Then, unexpectedly, a familiar presence entered the room. Ethan Blake had arrived, not announced in advance, but not entirely uninvited either, as if his presence had been allowed only to complete a pattern that others were already aware of. He looked different than I remembered, not in appearance, but in focus, as if he had spent too long trying to understand a result instead of accepting its arrival. Madison Carter was not with him. That absence carried its own weight, one that no one commented on but everyone seemed to register. Ethan's eyes found me almost immediately, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to contract into a smaller space between recognition and disbelief. He did not approach at first. Instead, he remained standing near the entrance, as if waiting for an older version of reality to return and correct what he was seeing. Victor did not acknowledge him directly, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Silence in that room was never emptiness, it was hierarchy made visible. Eventually Ethan moved closer, carefully, as if each step required permission from something he no longer understood. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the certainty I once associated with him. It was measured, hesitant, shaped by revision rather than confidence. He tried to reference the past without directly naming it, speaking instead about timing, misunderstanding, and choices that no longer aligned with expectation. I listened without interruption, not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer felt required to respond to a version of myself that no longer existed in his narrative. Victor finally spoke, not to interrupt Ethan, but to redefine the space between us. His words were calm, deliberate, and without emotional emphasis, stating only that some paths do not converge again once structure has changed. No one challenged him. No one needed to. That statement did not function as opinion. It functioned as finality. After a moment, Ethan looked at me directly, and in that silence between us, I recognized something I had not expected to feel, not anger, not satisfaction, but distance so complete it no longer required explanation. He had not lost me in a moment. He had lost access to the version of life where I belonged to his understanding of it. When he eventually stepped back, there was no dramatic exit, no confrontation, only a quiet withdrawal into the same uncertainty he had brought with him. The dinner continued as if nothing had shifted, but I knew better now. In places like this, change was never announced twice. Later that night, Victor and I returned without discussion of what had occurred, because nothing required interpretation anymore. As I stood alone again in the quiet of the house, I understood something more clearly than before. My life was no longer being corrected or reconsidered by those who once defined it. It was being maintained in a direction they could only observe from a distance. And for the first time, the absence of my former world did not feel like loss. It felt like structure finally settling into its intended form. I stopped waiting for people to understand me the day I realized understanding was never the requirement for change. It was early morning when Ethan Blake appeared again, not inside the house this time, but at the edge of its property, where the iron gate separated intention from access. I saw him from a distance through the glass corridor, standing still as if movement would confirm something he was not ready to accept. There was no anger in his posture, only a kind of exhaustion that comes from revisiting decisions that can no longer be rewritten. I did not go outside immediately. Instead, I stood where I was, observing him the same way I once observed the life I used to belong to, from a distance that no longer invited participation. Victor Moretti was already aware of his presence before I spoke a word. He did not react with concern or interest. He simply acknowledged it as one acknowledges an expected variable finally arriving. When I eventually stepped closer to the gate area, Ethan's eyes found mine through the barrier. There was a moment where I recognized the version of him I once believed in trying to surface again, but it collapsed almost immediately under its own irrelevance. He spoke first, carefully, as if testing whether language could still bridge what time had already separated. He mentioned regret without naming it directly, spoke about understanding things differently now, about seeing patterns he had missed before. But his words no longer reached me the way they once would have. They arrived, but they did not land. I listened without interrupting, not out of politeness, but because I no longer felt responsible for translating someone else's realization into my healing. When he finished, silence settled between us, not uncomfortable, but final. I finally responded, not with emotion, but with clarity. I told him that not every return is a reconciliation, and not every realization is an invitation. My voice did not rise. It did not need to. The distance between who I was and who I had become carried more weight than volume ever could. Ethan looked down for a moment, as if searching for a version of this moment where a different outcome still existed. But there was none. That version had already been lived and completed somewhere behind us. Victor approached quietly from behind me, stopping at a distance that confirmed rather than interrupted. He did not speak to Ethan. Instead, he addressed the space itself, reminding without emphasis that structure, once formed, does not bend backward to accommodate hesitation. That was not a threat. It was simply how order functions when it has already stabilized. Ethan did not argue. There was nothing left in him that believed argument could change position. After a few seconds, he stepped back from the gate, not dramatically, but with the subdued acceptance of someone who has finally recognized the limits of access. I watched him leave without following his movement, and in doing so, I realized something important. My life no longer required me to be understood by the people who once defined it. It required only that I remain aligned with where it had already chosen to go. When I turned away from the gate, Victor was still there, not guiding me, not correcting me, simply present as confirmation that nothing about this moment required reversal. And for the first time, I understood that power was not about being seen differently. It was about no longer needing to be seen at all in order to remain exactly where you are. The end did not arrive as an event. It arrived as recognition. Not sudden, not dramatic, but quietly inevitable, like a final piece of a structure locking into place after every adjustment had already been made. Days passed after Ethan Blake's last visit to the gates, and nothing external changed in a way the world would notice, yet everything inside my perception had already completed its shift. I no longer measured time by who was trying to reach me. I measured it by what no longer required explanation. Life inside Victor Moretti's world continued with the same controlled rhythm, each day defined not by emotion but by intention. There were meetings I was present for. Conversations I did not interrupt, and decisions where my presence was no longer questioned. I had stopped feeling like an observer moving through someone else's structure. I had started recognizing myself as part of it. One evening, Victor called me to the main hall without explanation. When I arrived, there were no guests, no formal setting, only him standing near the center of the room with the kind of stillness that always meant something important had already been decided. He did not ask me to sit. He simply acknowledged my presence as final confirmation of timing. People outside will continue to interpret your absence incorrectly, he said calmly, as if continuing a thought that had been in motion long before I entered the room. That is not your concern anymore. I did not respond immediately. I had learned that answers were not always required when understanding had already taken root. Instead, I looked at him and realized that the distance between my former life and this one was no longer emotional. It was structural. Ethan Blake's name no longer surfaced in my thoughts with the weight it once carried. Not because memory had faded, but because relevance had completed its cycle. He had become part of a version of time that no longer overlapped with mine. There was no regret in that realization, only confirmation that certain paths do not remain parallel once direction changes. Later that night, I stood alone near the same window where I had once begun to understand silence differently. The city of Chicago stretched far beyond the property, unchanged in appearance, yet entirely separate in meaning. Lights moved across distance like fragments of lives I was no longer attached to. I thought briefly about how easily people confuse visibility with importance, and how quickly they assume absence means loss. But I had learned something different. Absence, when chosen by structure rather than circumstance, becomes permanence in another form. Victor entered the room quietly, not to interrupt, but to stand beside me without speaking. There was no instruction, no correction, no expectation. Only alignment. After a moment, he spoke one final sentence that did not feel like advice or conclusion, but acknowledgement of completion. "You are no longer transitioning," he said. "You are established." I did not ask what came next, because the question no longer applied. My life was no longer positioned towards something unresolved. It had already arrived at its new form, and everything that remained was simply continuation without uncertainty. When I finally turned away from the window, there was no sense of departure from anything I had lost. Only the quiet understanding that I was no longer being pulled by the past. I was no longer being redirected by it. I was simply where I had already become. The final shift did not announce itself with arrival or departure, but with the absence of any need for either. Time inside the world I now inhabited no longer behaved like something chasing resolution. It had become continuity, steady and unbroken, as if every earlier moment had been preparing for a stillness that finally knew its own shape. I remember waking that morning without expectation, not because nothing could change, but because nothing outside me needed to define what had already been decided within me. The house of Victor Moretti remained unchanged in structure, yet everything about how I experienced it had settled into familiarity that no longer required adjustment. I moved through the space not as someone adapting, but as someone aligned. That distinction had become the quiet foundation of everything. Victor did not speak often about the past anymore. He did not need to. The past had already fulfilled its purpose in bringing me here, and anything beyond that existed only as reference, not influence. When he did speak, it was brief, deliberate, and without hesitation, as if words were no longer tools for persuasion but acknowledgments of completed understanding. That morning, he stood near the window overlooking the distant edge of the property and said nothing at first. The silence was no longer heavy between us. It was structured, like air in a room that had already been measured and accepted. Eventually, he spoke. "People will continue to remember you differently than you remember yourself," he said calmly. "That difference is no longer a problem to solve." I nodded slightly, not in agreement or disagreement, but in recognition. I had stopped believing that identity required public validation to exist. Somewhere far behind that moment, Ethan Blake continued living in a version of time that still tried to interpret what had already concluded. I no longer received messages from him. Not because contact had been blocked, but because the necessity of reaching me had dissolved into irrelevance. I did not imagine his regret as punishment or suffering. It simply existed now as an echo without direction, a thought that no longer had a place to land. Madison Carter's name no longer surfaced in any meaningful context either. Their story had not ended dramatically. It had simply stopped intersecting with mine. That afternoon, I walked alone through the exterior path of the property, something I had begun to do without instruction or purpose. The air carried a stillness that felt less like isolation and more like completion. The world beyond the gates still moved, still reacted, still believed in urgency. But I no longer belonged to its tempo. I belonged to something slower, more deliberate, something that did not ask to be understood in real time. When I returned inside, Victor was seated in the same room where many of my earlier transitions had quietly been acknowledged. He looked up briefly as I entered, then returned his attention forward, not because I was unimportant, but because my presence no longer required confirmation. It is not that your life changed, he said after a moment. It is that you stopped negotiating with it. I understood that then more fully than I ever had before. There was no final victory, no dramatic closure, no symbolic reversal waiting to complete a circle. There was only the recognition that I was no longer being rewritten by absence, memory, or regret. I was no longer positioned by what I had lost. I was sustained by what I had become. And in that quiet realization, I finally understood that the most complete form of transformation is not when the past disappears, but when it no longer has the authority to return you to who you were before it ended.